The meeting room was in absolute silence. The air conditioner blew a cold draft, but Ethan Carter felt sweat accumulating on the back of his neck. His eyes scanned the dark mahogany table, the faces of the partners, the lawyers, the investors. He knew that feeling well, the moment when the noose tightened, when the cards were on the table, and there was no elegant way out. "This is what we can offer," said Mark Holloway, his CFO, sliding a contract across the table. "But let's be honest, Ethan. Unless you have an ace up your sleeve, we're finished." Finished. The word hit deep. Ethan Carter was not a man who accepted defeat easily. For years, he had shaped his life and career based on the conviction that there was always a way, a plan B, a way to win. But there, facing those skeptical faces and the terrifying numbers from the past weeks, he saw the truth for the first time. This time, there was no escape. His empire was crumbling. Ethan picked up the contract and looked at it without really reading. He was losing clients, investors were jumping ship, and banks were no longer granting credit. His inflexible methods, his obsessive need for control, had led him to this moment. Then Mark cleared his throat and said hesitantly, "There is an alternative." Ethan looked up, a glimmer of hope flickering. "But you're not going to like it." Silence stretched. "Speak," Ethan ordered, his voice rougher than he intended. Mark hesitated. "We could try a merger with Bennett Enterprises." The name was a dagger to Ethan's chest. Claire Bennett. For a moment, everything around him seemed to dissolve. The room, the faces, the numbers flashing on the projector screen. Only her name remained echoing in his mind, along with memories he had spent years trying to ignore. Claire, barefoot and with her hair loose in their apartment, laughing at something he had said. Claire, in a dimly lit restaurant, her eyes shining as she talked about her dreams. Dreams he had never truly valued. Claire, closing the door in his face the last time he saw her. "You want me to go to Claire?" he asked, his voice emotionless. "She has what we need," Mark insisted. "Her company has grown absurdly in the past few years. She has liquidity, she has market share, and unlike us, she's not sinking." Ethan twirled his pen between his fingers, his jaw clenched. It was ironic. He had always prided himself on being the guy who never depended on anyone. He was always the one saving companies, never the other way around. And now, fate was playing this cruel joke. He needed Claire. He leaned back in his chair, let out a heavy sigh, and asked almost challengingly, "Does she know?" Mark exchanged an uncomfortable look with the other partners. "Not yet." Ethan nodded slowly. Of course she didn't know. Because if she did, Claire would probably have laughed in their faces before even hearing the proposal. He remained silent for a long moment. Then, with dark determination, he pushed back his chair and stood up. Set up the meeting. The restaurant was sophisticated and discreet, one of those places where business deals were made away from prying eyes. Ethan arrived first. He ordered a whiskey but didn't touch the glass. He just swirled the amber liquid, his gaze distant. Then she arrived. Claire entered like a silent storm. Her high heels echoed on the marble floor, and Ethan felt a tightness in his chest upon seeing her for the first time in years. She was different, more confident. Her brown hair now fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes were as sharp as blades. She wore a perfectly tailored black blazer, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She stopped in front of the table but didn't sit right away. She simply crossed her arms and analyzed Ethan as if he were a stranger. "If you're here thinking you can convince me with words," she said bluntly, "you've already wasted your time." Ethan looked up at her and for the first time in a long while, felt something uncomfortable. He wasn't in control of this situation. Claire sat down, keeping a careful distance. The waiter approached, but she declined to order anything. "So?" she said, resting her elbows on the table. "Let's cut to the chase. You need my help. Why should I care?" Ethan gave a slight smirk, trying to regain his composure. "This isn't charity," he replied. "I know you're too smart to throw money away. This is business." "Business?" Claire arched an eyebrow. "Funny you say that, because what you did with our marriage was also a business deal. I invested, Ethan. I gave everything I had, but the return never came." He felt the accusation like a punch, but he kept his composure. "I made mistakes," he admitted, "but this is different." "No, Ethan." Claire leaned slightly forward, her voice low, laced with irony. "This is exactly the same. You only come to me when you need something." The silence between them was razor sharp. Ethan took a deep breath. He could lie, say anything to convince her. But Claire wasn't stupid. If he tried to manipulate her, she'd see right through him. So he said, the only thing he could say, "What do you want?" Claire was silent for a moment, analyzing him. Then she picked up a napkin and quickly wrote something down. She slid the piece of paper toward him. Ethan took it and read it. His eyes narrowed. He looked up at Claire, confused. "Are you serious?" She gave a slight, humorless smile. 3 months, she said, "working under my rules. I want to see if you've changed. If after that time I think it's worth investing in you, we'll talk." Ethan clenched the napkin tightly. It was humiliating. It was a masterstroke. And deep down he knew he had no choice. "Deal," he said, his voice tense. Claire leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "Then I'll see you on Monday, Carter. And this time, you won't be the one in charge." Ethan Carter hated losing. It was a primal instinct, a resistance ingrained since childhood. He had grown up learning that winning wasn't an option. It was the only way out. His achievements were built on absolute control, quick decisions, and unwavering confidence. Yet here he was standing in the reception area of Bennett Enterprises, feeling like a fish out of water. The building was modern, surrounded by glass walls, with a minimalist and welcoming aesthetic, the opposite of what he was used to. In the hallways, employees moved at a relaxed pace, chatting, laughing. There was something different about this place, something he couldn't immediately name. In his company, people worked under constant pressure, fearing mistakes. Here there seemed to be life. The receptionist, a woman with curly hair and sharp eyes, analyzed him for a moment before forcing a polite smile. "Ethan Carter, Claire is expecting me." She scrolled through her computer screen and then looked up, slightly furrowing her brows. "Oh, so you're that Ethan." He didn't like the tone. Before he could ask what that meant, Claire appeared in the lobby. Unlike the previous night, she wasn't wearing a formal blazer but a navy blue dress that elegantly outlined her slender figure. Her heels echoed on the marble floor as she approached, her gaze fixed on him, calculated without any visible emotion. She stopped in front of him and crossed her arms. "Looks like you didn't run away." Ethan forced a smile, trying to maintain his composure. "And missed the chance to work for you?" "Not a chance." Claire didn't laugh. She simply turned and started walking down the glass hallway, and he followed without hesitation. "Let's get to the point," she said without looking back. "Here, you're not a CEO. You don't give orders. You're starting from zero." He raised an eyebrow. "Zero?" She opened the door to a conference room and gestured for him to enter. As soon as he stepped inside, Ethan felt the weight of the stairs on him. 6 people were seated around the table, their expressions filled with distrust. "Team," Claire announced without any warm introductions. "This is Ethan Carter. He'll be spending the next 3 months learning how a real company works." The blow was precise. Ethan kept his expression neutral, but he could feel his ego twisting inside. Claire was presenting him to her team as a rookie, a trainee. The humiliation was palpable. She slid into the head seat and continued, "Ethan, you'll be working in the business development department under the division director, Max Whitmore." Max Whitmore. The name wasn't unfamiliar. And then, a tall man with dark hair and a smirk full of irony extended a hand toward him. Ethan gripped his fingers harder than necessary. "Welcome, Carter," Max said, his tone almost challenging. Great. Not only would he be working under someone else's command, but he'd also have to deal with this guy. The first few hours were hell. Max made sure to assign him tasks that, in his old company, would never have come close to his desk. He spent the morning reviewing basic contracts, adjusting proposals, and drafting administrative reports. Work that, at Carter Industries, he would have delegated to an intern. But now, sitting at that desk like any other employee, Ethan had to accept the fact that no one here cared about his past as a CEO. For the first time in years, he wasn't the boss. Around 3 in the afternoon, Claire appeared in the doorway. "How's it going?" Max exchanged an amused glance with the other team members before answering. "Our new trainee is doing just fine." Ethan didn't bother responding. He simply forced a smile and got back to work, ignoring the amused looks around him. But Claire didn't seem satisfied. "Great. Then tomorrow morning you'll be in the customer service department. Ethan froze. He slowly looked up, unable to believe what he had just heard. What? Claire tilted her head slightly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Is there a problem? He closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. You want me, Ethan Carter, to spend the day listening to customer complaints? She smiled faintly. If you plan to be a better leader, you need to understand the struggles at the base. Then, without leaving room for further discussion, she turned and walked away. Ethan sat there for a long moment, feeling the stares on him. She was enjoying this, but he wouldn't give up so easily. The next day was pure humiliation. He spent 6 hours in a small room, alongside 2 support agents, listening to customers complain about delays, technical issues, and demanding quick solutions. At first, he tried suggesting direct, more efficient responses, but he quickly realized that this department operated in a completely different way than he was used to. Here, empathy mattered more than logic. You have to listen before you respond, said Julia, one of the agents. Sometimes people just want to know they're not talking to a robot. Ethan clenched his jaw but absorbed the lesson. Around 4 in the afternoon, Claire appeared again. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, analyzing him for a moment. So? Survived? Ethan took off the headset and ran a hand over his face, exhausted. I'd rather negotiate $1 million contract 1,000 times over than deal with an angry customer. She laughed, a genuine, unexpected sound. Welcome to the human side of business, Carter. He stood up, straightening his wrinkled suit. If this is a test, know that I won't quit. Claire crossed her arms, watching him closely. You've always been good at persisting when you want something. For a brief moment, the silence between them carried something neither seemed willing to name. The weight of the past wrapped around them like an invisible specter. Ethan realized that, no matter how much Claire tried to maintain her cold demeanor, there was still something there. Something unresolved. She was the first to look away. Don't mess this up, Ethan. Then she turned and walked away. He stood there, watching her leave, feeling a growing restlessness in his chest. Deep down, he knew. He didn't just want to save his company. He wanted to save something much bigger. Ethan Carter was beginning to understand what it meant to lose control. For the past few weeks, he had followed Claire's rules, swallowed his pride, worked like any other employee, and tried to fit into a world that wasn't his. But he was Ethan Carter. He always had a plan. He always had a way out. Or at least, he thought he did. Now, standing in the middle of Claire's office, looking at the papers scattered across the table, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The documents were there, clear and brutal. A merger contract between Carter Industries and one of Claire's biggest competitors. A deal that, if finalized, would leave her vulnerable, allowing her company to be devoured piece by piece. And there it was, his name, signed on the dotted line as if he himself had set the trap. Claire stood across from him, her green eyes blazing with fury and hurt. She held one of the papers in her hand, fingers clenched around the sheet as if trying not to tear it apart. Tell me this isn't what it looks like, Ethan. The weight of the accusation hit him like a punch. He grabbed the contract, his eyes scanning the signature again. His name was there, but he hadn't signed it. Bile rose in his throat. Mark, his CFO, his right-hand man, the person who had been by his side throughout the Carter Industries crisis. He knew Ethan needed an investor. He knew Ethan would do anything to save the company. And now, it seemed someone had made the decision for him. Claire, listen, Ethan began, but she slammed the papers down on the table, cutting him off. No, this time, I talk. There was anger in her voice, but what really destroyed him was the pain mixed in with it. Claire wasn't just furious, she was hurt. You never changed, did you? Her voice was low but laced with cutting coldness. All this time, all this effort, it was all just a game to you. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Do you really believe that? What else am I supposed to believe? Claire threw the papers on the table and took a step back, as if she didn't want to be near him. I trusted you, Ethan. Against all my instincts, against everything I've learned these past few years, I started to think that maybe you had changed. Ethan saw it in her eyes. The exact moment that possibility died. It was like reliving the past. 5 years ago, she had stood in front of him in the apartment they once shared. Her suitcase was packed, the door slightly open, the decision made. Tell me I matter more than Carter Industries. Tell me you can change. He had stayed silent for too long, and then she was gone. Now looking at Claire, Ethan felt like he was back in that night. But this wasn't the past. This was the present. And if he didn't do something now, he would lose Claire again. He pulled out a chair and slowly sat down, trying to contain the tension pounding in his chest. "Give me a chance to fix this." Claire let out a short, humorless laugh. "Why? So you can manipulate the situation again?" He met her gaze, steady. "Because I'm not that man anymore." She held her breath for a moment. It was quick, but Ethan noticed. He noticed that for a second she wanted to believe him. But then, Claire blinked, and the coldness returned. "You have until tomorrow morning to prove it, or you're out." Ethan knew, in that moment, that this was his last chance. If he failed, he wouldn't just lose Carter Industries. He would lose Claire. And this time, forever. Ethan walked out of Bennett Enterprises, his blood boiling. He grabbed his phone and dialed quickly. "Mark. Now." His CFO's voice sounded hesitant on the other end. "Ethan, can we talk later?" "Later?" The fury in his voice was almost tangible. "You signed that contract in my name?" There was silence on the other end. "We needed a plan, Ethan. You weren't doing anything, so I took the initiative." "You sold me out," Ethan growled, crossing the street without even looking at the cars. "You put my name on a deal that destroys any chance I had with Claire. Do you really think she was ever going to invest in us?" Mark shot back, something almost cynical in his tone. "Ethan, stop fooling yourself. Claire doesn't want to help you. She wants to see you humiliated." Ethan gripped his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm fixing this. And you? You're fired." He hung up before he could hear a response. The night passed without sleep. Ethan went through every transaction from the past few weeks, re-examined the documents, and with the help of a trusted lawyer, found a loophole that could nullify the contract. By 5 in the morning, he was back at Bennett Enterprises. The reception area was still empty, but he went straight to Claire's office. He waited. When she arrived, her eyes were tired, but her posture remained the same, unshakable. Ethan stood up slowly and placed the folder of documents on her desk. "This is everything," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Records, proof that I didn't sign anything." Claire looked at him for a long moment before picking up the papers. She flipped through them slowly, analyzing every detail. Then, she exhaled. She believed him, but that didn't mean everything was fixed. "You should have been paying more attention, Ethan." The weight of those words hit him hard. She was right. Even if he hadn't signed that contract, he had allowed it to get this far. He had been so focused on saving his company that he didn't realize he was making the same mistakes as before, and it could have cost him everything. He ran a hand over his face, exhausted. "What can I do to make this right?" Claire lifted her gaze to him, and for the first time something in her facade cracked. "Show me that you've actually learned something, Carter. Not with words, with actions." Ethan held her gaze. The real test started now, and this time he wasn't willing to lose. The clock read 5:42 a.m. when Ethan Carter brought the coffee cup to his lips and realized it was cold. He had spent the entire night at his lawyer's office, poring over contracts, analyzing documents, and trying to understand how the hell he had allowed his own company to nearly destroy him. He knew his negligence with the details had been a mistake, but realizing he had almost let Mark sign his professional death sentence was a hard pill to swallow. Now sitting in the reception area of Bennett Enterprises, he felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. He never doubted himself. Never. But as he waited for Claire to arrive, he couldn't ignore the feeling that this time, his intelligence and ambition alone might not be enough. The elevator doors opened and Claire stepped into the hallway. Her brown hair was pulled back into a low bun, her face slightly tired, but her posture as impeccable as ever. The gray blazer framed her slender silhouette, and her green eyes met his before she even reached him. For a moment, Ethan wished he could see what she was thinking. Claire stopped a few steps away and crossed her arms. "Did you use your time to come up with excuses, or did you find a solution?" Her voice was cold, but he detected a hint of curiosity beneath it. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't try to be charming. He simply handed her the folder of documents he was holding. Claire took the papers and flipped through them, her eyes scanning each line with surgical precision. The silence between them was heavy, the only sound being the rustling of pages. Then she exhaled. She believed him. But that didn't mean everything was fixed. Claire set the papers down on the glass table and crossed her arms. You managed to stop the contract. But that wasn't the only problem. Ethan held her gaze, waiting for her to continue. The problem, Ethan, she said slowly, is that at some point you thought you could fix everything alone. You trusted Mark. You let him sign for you. That tells me that deep down, you still think you can control everything around you, just like you always have. Her words were sharp as blades. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew Claire was right. She took a step closer, narrowing her eyes. And you know what else that tells me? That you don't trust anyone. You never trusted me. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words. Claire had always been by his side. At the beginning of their marriage, in the days when his company was still just a promise, in the moments when success felt like a distant dream, but he had never let her fully into his world. He had always made the decisions believing he was protecting her, but in reality, he had only shut her out. And then, one day, she got tired and walked away. Ethan shifted his gaze to the city view through the glass wall. The lights in the surrounding buildings were starting to fade, making way for the beginning of a new day. I didn't want to drag you into my problems. Claire let out a short laugh. Don't you see that's exactly the problem? You never gave me the chance to stand by your side. You always acted like it was safer to keep me away. She took a deep breath, hugging her arms around herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. I never wanted money, Ethan. I wanted you. Ethan felt a suffocating tightness in his chest. He had never heard her say it so directly before, and somehow hearing it now, when it might already be too late, destroyed him. Claire shook her head, as if pushing her own thoughts aside. But it's okay, because now, I don't need you either. That hurt more than any punch he could have taken. Ethan ran a hand over his face, exhausted. What can I do to change that? She studied him for a long moment. Prove it to me, Ethan. Not with words, with actions. Ethan didn't respond, but for the first time he knew exactly what he needed to do. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Bennett Enterprises without his usual impeccably tailored suit. He wore a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark jeans. It was a small detail, but he knew it meant something. He wasn't here as a CEO. He was here as someone who needed to learn. Claire met him in the lobby and glanced him up and down. Good morning, she said simply. Good morning. She gave a half smile and started walking down the hall. Today, you're spending the day with me. He raised an eyebrow. I thought I was already working here. She stopped and looked at him. Working here and understanding how I do things are two very different things. Ethan didn't argue. The first stop was a conference room on the 8th floor. Claire had a presentation with investors, and Ethan observed as she spoke. He analyzed the way she handled difficult questions, how she stayed composed without being condescending. She was brilliant, and he had never taken the time to realize that before. After the meeting, they walked through the creative department. Claire introduced Ethan to every employee, and he noticed how she knew them by name, how she asked about their lives, how she genuinely cared. He wondered how many of his own employees he actually remembered by name. The day went on, and Claire took him through meetings, strategic decisions, conversations with clients. Ethan realized that the entire time she was watching him, waiting to see if he would try to take control of something, if he would revert to being the man she once knew. But for the first time, he just listened. At the end of the workday, Claire called him into her office. She leaned against her desk and studied him for a moment. You've been quiet all day. That's not like you. Ethan shrugged. Maybe I'm actually learning something. She sighed and crossed her arms. You know what used to irritate me the most? I imagine the list is long. She laughed. You never asked for my opinion. He looked at her carefully. And why is it so different now? Ethan took a deep breath. Because for the first time I actually want to change. Claire blinked slowly, and for a moment, he thought he saw her barriers start to fall. But instead she picked up an envelope from her desk and handed it to him. He opened it and found a contract. A new contract. He looked up, confused. What's this? She took a deep breath. An offer for you to stay here. Ethan felt something inside him shift. Claire was giving him the chance to be part of this, but this time he knew he couldn't accept it lightly. And if I screw it all up again? She gave a small smile. Then this time you fix it. That night, as they walked out of the building together, Ethan glanced at Claire under the soft glow of the streetlights. Have dinner with me? She stopped. As co-workers? He smiled. However you want it to be. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Okay, Carter. But this time, no empty promises. He smiled. This time, he was going to prove it. The restaurant exuded an elegant yet cozy atmosphere, with soft lighting and tables decorated with low candles that cast delicate shadows over the wine glasses. The aroma of fresh herbs and spices lingered in the air, blending with the quiet hum of conversations around them. Claire kept her eyes fixed on the menu, but her mind wasn't really there. The last time they had dinner together had been years ago, and back then, having Ethan by her side was routine, not an exception. Now he was sitting across from her as a different man, or at least trying to be. But had he really changed? Ethan flipped through the menu as if he were analyzing a multi-million-dollar contract. She smirked slightly, unable to hold back the thought. You've always been terrible at making decisions when it comes to food. He looked up at her, surprised, then let out a low, genuine laugh. Your fault. You always chose for me. Claire tilted her head, resting her chin on her hand. Because I knew that if I let you choose, you'd end up ordering steak and whiskey. Ethan closed the menu with a soft snap, setting it aside. Well then, tell me, what should I order tonight? She pursed her lips, pretending to think. Something different. A dish you wouldn't normally order. He raised an eyebrow, challenging. And if I hate it? Then you'll learn that not everything goes as planned. The exchange of looks was charged with something Claire didn't want to name. For a moment, the past didn't feel like a weight between them, but she quickly raised her hand to call the waiter, breaking the moment. He'll have the truffle mushroom risotto, she said without hesitation. The waiter nodded and took the order. When she turned back to Ethan, he was smirking. You still like to take control of things. Only when I know the other person is going to make the wrong choice. Ethan chuckled, picking up his wine glass. I have to admit, Claire, I missed this. She remained silent for a moment, absent-mindedly swirling her own glass. Missed what? Us. This dynamic. The way you know me better than I know myself. She looked away. Things have changed. I know, but that doesn't mean I've forgotten. Claire took a deep breath. Ethan Carter never allowed himself to be vulnerable, but here he was, trying, and that scared her. Dinner continued with lighter conversations, memories from the past that didn't hurt as much anymore. But there was something in the air, a lingering tension they both felt but neither was ready to acknowledge. When they finished, Ethan paid the bill without ceremony and walked with her to the car. The night was cool, and a soft breeze played with Claire's hair. Thanks for making me order something different, he said. And? He smiled. I still prefer steak and whiskey. Claire laughed, shaking her head. He opened the car door for her, hesitating for a moment before stepping back. See you tomorrow, Claire. She nodded, sliding into the driver's seat. See you tomorrow, Carter. But as she drove home, she felt her heart beating faster than it should. The following days settled into a strange routine, filled with unspoken tension. Ethan remained focused on work, watching the way Claire ran her company with mastery, and he began to understand the depth of what he had lost. But despite all the progress, the barrier between them remained firmly in place. Until, on a Friday night, Claire received a call that changed everything. Claire, it's me, Julia. We need you at the office now. Her assistant's voice was laced with concern. Claire frowned. What happened? We have a problem with an important client. Ethan is already here trying to fix it, but I thought you'd want to know. A tight knot formed in Claire's stomach. I'm on my way. When Claire arrived at the office, she found Ethan standing in the hallway outside the conference room, his expression tense, shoulders rigid. What happened? He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. One of our biggest clients is threatening to terminate the contract. There was an issue with the last batch of services and he refuses to negotiate. She crossed her arms. And what did you do? I tried to handle it the way I always have, he admitted. Firm negotiation, numbers, strategy. But he's not interested in listening. Claire exhaled sharply and, without another word, pushed open the door and stepped inside. Ethan watched as she handled the situation completely differently. Claire didn't try to exhaust the client with logic, didn't impose ready-made solutions. She listened. She let him vent his frustrations, absorbed every complaint before finally speaking. And when she responded, her voice was firm, but calm. By the end of the meeting, the client agreed to renegotiate the terms. Claire stepped out of the room and looked at Ethan. That's how it's done. He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there watching her. After a long moment, he said, "You're incredible at this." She crossed her arms. "Yes, I am." He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "And I was an idiot for never realizing it before." Claire's gaze softened for a second, but her firm posture quickly returned. "Well, Carter, some lessons take longer to learn." He nodded, accepting the truth in her words. But that night, as Ethan Carter walked out of Bennett Enterprises, a certainty settled deep within him. He didn't just want to prove he had changed. He wanted Claire back. And this time, he wouldn't give up. The night was cool as Ethan stepped out of the Bennett Enterprises building. The city glowed around him, but he couldn't see anything beyond the memory of Claire's gaze. The way her eyes had softened for a second before she put that invisible wall back up. He knew what it meant. Claire still felt something for him. But he also knew that wasn't enough. She wasn't the woman he had left behind. And if he wanted to win her back, he couldn't be the man he once was. Ethan took a deep breath, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket as he walked toward his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a brief moment he thought it might be Claire. But when he looked at the screen, his stomach dropped. Mark. For a second he considered ignoring it. But then he answered. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold. "A little gratitude would be appropriate, Carter." Mark responded on the other end, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "After all, I was the one who tried to save your company." Ethan felt his blood boil. "You betrayed me. I made a decision any businessman in your position would have made. But you're so obsessed with Claire that you've forgotten what really matters." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "If you think I'd choose money over her again, then you never really knew me at all." Mark let out a long sigh. "Well, Carter, I hope you're right about that. But a word of advice. People like us don't change, and Claire will never trust you again." The line went dead, and Ethan stood there, gripping his phone tightly beside his car. Maybe Mark was right. Maybe Claire would never forgive him. But he had to try. The following days brought a new dynamic between them. Ethan continued working at Bennett Enterprises, no longer out of obligation, but because he wanted to be there. He absorbed every detail of how Claire ran her business, how she solved problems, how she kept the company thriving without resorting to fear or intimidation. She was different from him in every way, and for the first time he didn't see that as a bad thing. But despite his progress, Claire still maintained a clear boundary between them. Professionally, they worked well together, but beyond that, she still kept her distance. Until on a Thursday night, Ethan saw an opportunity to break that barrier. It was late when Claire finally shut down her computer and stepped out of her office, exhausted. Ethan watched her from across the office, leaning against one of the communal desks. "Long day?" he asked. She sighed. "Like every other." He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and walked toward her. "Then I think we deserve a break." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Is that an invitation?" Ethan smirked. "Only if you say yes." She studied him for a moment. "Where to?" He shrugged. "Come with me and find out." The car moved smoothly down the road, and Claire shot him a suspicious look. "If this is some kind of kidnapping attempt, I should warn you. I know how to defend myself." He laughed. "You always did." She shook her head but didn't press further. When the car finally stopped, she frowned as she recognized the place. The old Pier 28, a small restaurant outside the city right by the river. "Ethan, I know," he said, stepping out of the car and opening the door for her. "But I thought it'd be a good place to remember." Claire hesitated. They used to come here when they were together. It was a simple, quiet place where they escaped the chaos of their routines. "You're playing with fire, Carter." "I was never good at avoiding risks." She sighed and stepped out of the car. Dinner was peaceful, weightless, without expectations. Just two old acquaintances sharing a meal. Ethan watched her closely, noticing the little details. The way she held her wine glass, how she looked away when she was deep in thought, how she bit her lower lip when she hesitated before speaking. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Claire looked at him. "About how, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd be here with you, I would have laughed in their face." Ethan smiled. "Me too." She took a sip of wine, gazing at the scenery around them. "I just don't know where any of this is going." Ethan rested his elbows on the table, leaning forward slightly. "And what if I told you that for the first time? I don't know either." She frowned. "You always knew what you wanted. And that's exactly why I messed everything up last time. Silence stretched between them. I don't want to pressure you, Claire. I'm not asking you to believe in me for no reason. I just want to be here, one day at a time. She studied him for a moment. Then finally she smiled. One day at a time, Carter. The following months felt like a quiet reconstruction. Ethan stayed by Claire's side, working with her, understanding her methods, learning to see the world differently. He was no longer the arrogant man who believed everything revolved around him. He learned to be present. Occasional dinners became more frequent. Their conversations stopped being only about work. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. Until, one ordinary night, when Ethan drove her home after another dinner, he stopped at her door and hesitated. Claire noticed. "What is it?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath before meeting her eyes. "I love you, Claire." She froze. He saw the fear in her gaze. "Ethan, you don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." Claire lowered her eyes. "I'm scared." He reached for her hand, his fingers lightly brushing hers. "I know." She finally looked at him. And then she did something Ethan didn't expect. She grabbed his shirt and kissed him. It was a kiss full of everything they had never said, all the unspoken words, all the years apart. When they pulled away, Claire still had her eyes closed, breathing deeply. "One day at a time," she whispered. Ethan smiled, his hand tightening around hers. One day at a time. This time he didn't need promises. He already knew he would make it count.